Clara Hayes woke to a blaze of light, spilling across silk curtains, her eyes blinking open slowly, while her head felt heavy and her throat dry. Her limbs were tangled in sheets that were too soft to belong to her modest apartment. The ceiling above was carved in clean lines with recessed lights and polished steel accents, and the scent in the air was faintly expensive, some blend of sandalwood and citrus that clung to the edges of memory. For a long moment she lay still, unsure if she was dreaming, until the reality of it pressed in and forced her upright with a sudden gasp. The sheet slipped down, baring her shoulders, and she froze when she noticed the scattered clothes across the floor. Her black dress draped across a leather chair, one strap torn. Her heels abandoned near the doorway, and nearby a tailored jacket, crumpled with a white shirt, half-buttoned beside it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Because this was not her home, this was not her bed, and she was not alone. Beside her on the other side of the wide mattress lay a man, his breathing deep, steady, and untroubled, his hair dark and slightly tousled his jaw. Strong, the cut of his cheekbones sharp, and his body relaxed in a way that spoke of absolute control. Even in slumber he seemed untouchable. She could not mistake it. This was the man from last night, the stranger. Fragments of memory flooded back with cruel clarity. The restaurant with glittering chandeliers, the wrong table she had stumbled toward, in nervous haste, the deep voice that had offered to let her stay. The laughter over glasses of wine, his eyes watching her, as if he wanted to unravel her thoughts. The long walk into the night, the city humming around them, the brush of his hand against her cheek, and then the blur of elevator doors and whispered words high above the streets. Then came the moment that made her throat tighten now, her own voice shaky and vulnerable, saying it was her first time, his startled pause, his gaze turning solemn instead of mocking, the weight of that truth hanging between them like fragile glass. She had thought he would laugh, or worse, grow impatient, but he had not, instead moving carefully, with every gesture measured and every touch restrained. It had not been careless lust, it had been something else, something she was still afraid to name. Clara pressed her hands to her face, shame and disbelief tangling until she could hardly breathe. She had spent her entire life guarding herself, promising that when the moment came, it would be with someone who truly saw her. Yet here she was, her body aching with proof that her first time had been given to a stranger whose name she had barely caught between sips of wine. The man stirred, and Clara dropped her hands, her heart hammering. His eyes opened a stormy gray in the morning light, and for an instant his gaze found hers. It was not soft, not cruel, but something in between, detached as though he were accustomed to waking beside women he would never see again. He did not speak, only watched her, and then closed his eyes once more, rolling onto his back, and the gesture stung more than words. Clara slid from the bed, clutching the sheet against her body, as her legs trembled, while she searched for her clothes, fumbling to gather them from the floor. Every motion felt loud in the cavernous silence of the penthouse, with its glass walls offering a sweeping view of New York marble floors, polished to a shine, and furniture arranged with minimalist precision. It was wealth on display, the kind she had only glimpsed in glossy magazines. And whoever this man was, he belonged to a world she had no place in. She slipped into her dress, wincing at the torn strap, shoved her feet into her heels, and hurried toward the door, her pulse thudding in her ears, not daring to look back at the bed. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, flashbulbs exploded, and Clara flinched as voices shouted her name with questions hurled in rapid succession. Cameras clicked relentless as she raised a hand to shield her face, panic rising, wondering how they had known. Paparazzi pressed closer, jostling, calling out the name of the man she had left behind, a name she barely registered through the roar. In that instant, Clara realized her mistake had not ended at sunrise. It had only just begun, because the world outside already knew who the stranger was, though she herself did not. By the time she escaped down the service stairwell, heart-pounding, one truth echoed louder than the rest: that her first night, the one she had guarded for so long, now belonged to a man she knew nothing about, and the world would never let her forget it. Clara Hayes had always been the sort of young woman who slipped into the background of crowded rooms, never one to crave the spotlight, never one to invite too much attention. Yet somehow fate had dragged her into the brightest glare overnight. At 25 years old, she worked as a junior public relations associate at a mid-sized firm in Manhattan, her days filled with drafting press releases, monitoring media coverage, and occasionally handling minor clients who wanted to believe they mattered as much as the big accounts. She was competent and diligent, but rarely celebrated her supervisors, often overlooking her, because she lacked the polish of those who came from wealthier families. Clara's background was modest, and the sharp edges of her life had carved her into someone both resilient and cautious. Her mother had died of illness when Clara was only 14, leaving her with a father who remarried quickly and withdrew into his own world of obligations, leaving Clara feeling like an outsider in her own home. The new stepmother viewed her more as a duty than as a daughter, and dinners often passed in silence, punctuated only by criticisms of Clara's quiet ways. By the time she turned 18, she had moved into a small apartment with the savings she had scraped together from part-time jobs, determined to live independently, even if it meant sacrificing comfort. That independence became her armor. She worked long hours, kept her friendships close, but few, and guarded her heart fiercely. Relationships had always been complicated. Men who approached her seemed to expect more than she was ready to give, and Clara carried her virginity not as a badge but as a quiet decision that she wanted it to mean something when she finally shared it. She had promised herself she would wait for a man who saw her as more than a fleeting distraction. Yet loneliness whispered in the spaces between her resolve, and sometimes she caught herself envying couples she saw on subway trains or in parks. Her best friend, a lively and outgoing colleague named Megan, had grown frustrated with Clara's insistence on avoiding the dating world. One evening over wine, Megan had grabbed Clara's phone and installed a dating app, teasing her into setting up a profile. Clara resisted, rolling her eyes, but finally allowed it as a harmless experiment. It was Megan who arranged the blind date, assuring Clara that nothing serious had to come of it, only a chance to dress up and talk to someone new. Clara agreed, not realizing that this small concession would tilt her entire world. Adrian Cole existed on an entirely different plane of life. At 32 years old, he had already become one of the most influential names in global technology. As the founder and CEO of Cole Dynamics, a corporation that specialized in artificial intelligence systems, he was both admired and feared in business circles. His company had transformed from a small startup in a cramped garage to a multi-billion-dollar empire within less than a decade, his vision for predictive algorithms and robotics setting new standards. To the media, he was the enigmatic billionaire with piercing eyes and a tendency to avoid interviews. He rarely appeared at public galas except when absolutely necessary, and even then he carried an air of disinterest, as though human company was more burden than joy. Wealth to him was a byproduct, not a pursuit, and yet the world obsessed over the details of his life, speculating endlessly about the women he might secretly date or the projects he kept hidden. What few understood was that Adrian's distance was not arrogance, but a shield. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. Adrian had been the one to identify the body, and the guilt of having encouraged his brother to attend that fateful party never released its grip. Since then, he buried himself in work, vowing that emotional attachments only led to pain. Women entered his orbit, occasionally drawn by his status and intensity, but none lingered. He treated relationships as transactions brief and forgettable. Rumors followed him, stories of models and socialites leaving his penthouse in the early hours, but none of them had reached beyond the surface. Beneath his composed exterior, he carried grief and a relentless sense of duty, channeling his energy into expanding his empire. He lived at the top of a tower in Manhattan, with views stretching for miles, a symbol of both achievement and isolation. In spite of his fortune, Adrian remained essentially alone. He dined at long tables by himself, worked through nights without pause, and stared at city lights without anyone to share them with. His closest confidant was his personal assistant George, a man who had been with him since college. But even George could not breach the walls around his heart. What Adrian longed for, though he never admitted it, was someone who could look at him and not see the billionaire, not see the empire, but see simply the man he was when he stripped away the power. That was why the wrong date had caught him off guard. When Clara sat across from him that evening, confusion flashing in her eyes, he had known immediately she did not recognize him. She saw not the mogul plastered on magazine covers, but merely a stranger at a table. And something about that innocence, that lack of calculation, stirred a curiosity he had not felt in years. Clara's laughter, nervous yet genuine, reminded him of a world before loss and responsibility, while her awkward honesty cut through the layers of pretense he had grown accustomed to. Their meeting was an accident of timing and misunderstanding, yet it carried the weight of destiny. Clara and Adrian could not have been more different in circumstance, yet both were bound by solitude, both scarred by family fractures, both wary of love. Their paths should never have crossed yet. One mistaken table set into motion a chain of events that neither could stop. He was a man who believed emotions were luxuries he could not afford. She was a woman who believed love was too fragile to risk. Together, without knowing it, they were about to test both convictions. Clara stepped out of the cab that evening with her stomach in knots, smoothing down the simple navy dress Megan had insisted she wear. The restaurant gleamed with golden lights, spilling through tall windows, every table inside set with crystal glasses and pristine linens. She hesitated on the sidewalk, clutching her phone to recheck the app, her heart fluttering with nerves. This was supposed to be a harmless blind date, something to humor her best friend, yet even now she wondered if she should turn back. But Megan's encouraging texts rang in her head, and Clara drew a deep breath, pushing through the glass doors, into the warmth and chatter of Manhattan's dining elite. The hostess smiled and asked for her name, then gestured toward a corner table. Clara moved forward with uncertain steps, scanning the crowded room. She spotted a man seated alone, tall and broad-shouldered. His posture relaxed but commanding. He wore a dark blazer open at the collar, no tie, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run impatient fingers through it. He seemed absorbed in a glass of red wine, his eyes distant. Convinced this must be her date, Clara approached. "Excuse me, are you Daniel?" she asked softly, clutching her purse strap. The man looked up, his gaze, cool and unreadable for a moment, before something flickered in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or curiosity. "No," he replied in a low voice, "but you can sit if you like." Clara flushed already, mortified, but the words left her lips before she could retreat. "I am supposed to meet someone from the app. Maybe I got the wrong table." She half turned as though to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Stay," he said, tilting his head toward the empty chair. "The restaurant is busy, and you look like you could use a place to sit." Something in his tone, steady yet not unkind, compelled her. She slid into the chair, trying not to notice how his eyes followed her. For several minutes they exchanged polite fragments of conversation, Clara fumbling through small talk while he answered sparingly. She felt the heat in her cheeks rise. This was ridiculous. She should find the right table and excuse herself. But when she reached for her phone, the man asked roughness, softening in his tone. "Do you come here often?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. "No," she admitted, "not at all. I usually grab takeout from a deli near my apartment. Fancy places like this are not my usual." His mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, but it eased the tension. "What do you do?" he asked. "Public relations," she said, "but mostly small accounts. Nothing glamorous." She waited for judgment, for the slight disdain she had grown used to from men who measured worth in money and prestige, but instead his gaze sharpened with interest. "That sounds demanding. Do you like it?" Clara considered, then shrugged. "Some days I do. I like helping people shape their stories, even if nobody else notices." He raised his glass, studying her, as though her words revealed more than she intended. Unlike the men she had encountered before, he did not interrupt, did not steer the conversation toward himself. He asked questions quietly, almost clinically, yet each answer she gave seemed to hold his attention. Slowly the awkwardness bled away, and Clara found herself laughing at her own clumsy jokes, noticing the way his eyes softened when she smiled. They ordered dinner, almost as an afterthought, plates of seared salmon and roasted vegetables arriving between their words. He ate sparingly, sipping wine, while she rambled about office mishaps and her eccentric neighbor who played saxophone at midnight. He listened without visible impatience, though she wondered why he let her chatter on. Halfway through the meal, she realized she had not even asked his name. She blurted the question, then covered her mouth in embarrassment. "Adrian," he said simply. "Just Adrian." She repeated it softly, liking the way it felt ordinary and unassuming. The noise of the restaurant faded as they talked, a small bubble forming around their table. She did not notice Megan's frantic texts, wondering how the date was going. Nor did she see the man she was actually supposed to meet, searching at the bar. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Adrian spoke little of himself, but when Clara pressed gently, he revealed fragments: a brother he once lost to childhood in the city, a relentless focus on work, His eyes darkened when he mentioned the accident, and Clara instinctively reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He stilled at her touch, as if unused to such spontaneous kindness, then inclined his head. "Thank you." It was the first time his voice carried something like vulnerability. The connection startled her. She had walked in expecting stilted conversation and maybe an awkward goodbye, but instead found herself drawn into the orbit of a man she could not quite define. She felt seen, not judged, and the warmth of that realization unsettled her. By the time dessert arrived, she was laughing freely, her nerves forgotten. Adrian's gaze lingered steady and unreadable, but she thought she saw a flicker of admiration. When the bill came, he waved away her attempt to contribute his movements economical, as though money was the least of concerns. Clara protested weakly, but he only said, "Consider it my thanks for your company." Outside, the night air wrapped around them, the city alive with honking taxis and glowing billboards. Clara pulled her coat tighter, her pulse still racing from the strange intimacy of the evening. Adrian walked beside her without touching, yet she felt his presence as strongly as if his arm were around her. When she stumbled slightly on the curb, he steadied her with one hand at her elbow, the contact brief but electric. They paused under a street lamp, silence stretching between them. Clara searched for words but found none. Adrian's gaze held hers, something unspoken, passing in that moment a promise, or perhaps a warning. She wanted to ask why he had let her stay, why he had not corrected her mistake at the table, but instead she whispered, "Thank you for tonight." His reply was almost inaudible. "You are welcome." He hailed a cab, opened the door for her, and for an instant she hesitated, wishing the night would not end. As the cab pulled away, she turned back to see him standing under the lamp, his figure solitary, his expression unreadable. Clara pressed her hand against her racing heart. She had gone to dinner with a stranger, sat at the wrong table, and yet she felt as though she had glimpsed something rare. She had no idea who he truly was, or what his life contained. But she knew this much: she wanted to see him again. And for Adrian, watching the cab vanish into traffic, the echo of her laughter lingered in the night air. Like a melody he had almost forgotten. Clara told herself she should go home after the cab dropped her at the curb, that the night had been enough of a risk already, that one wrong date with a stranger should not become anything more yet. When she saw Adrian waiting outside the restaurant, instead of walking away, as she had assumed, her feet betrayed her and carried her toward him. He stood effortlessly composed beneath the city lights, hands in his pockets, his eyes lifting when she approached. The silence between them pulsed with a strange tension, neither oppressive nor easy, something in between that demanded resolution. "Are you headed home?" he asked in a voice that rumbled low and steady. She hesitated, nodding though her heart whispered otherwise. "Then let me see you there," he said. It was not a question, but it was not force either. She felt a flutter of hesitation before finally agreeing. They hailed another cab together, and the ride passed in a blur of streetlights, flashing across the windows, her pulse racing every time their shoulders brushed. Clara spoke of trivial things to fill the silence, but Adrian only listened, his gaze occasionally fixed on her reflection in the glass. When the driver asked for her address, she panicked, embarrassed by the thought of him, seeing her modest walk-up apartment, and stammered instead that she lived nearby. Adrian studied her, then quietly instructed the driver to his building. The elevator doors closed around them with a soft hiss, and Clara felt her throat tighten. Adrian tapped a code into a private panel, the numbers glowing. The car rising higher and higher until her ears popped. When the doors opened, the penthouse sprawled before her, a sweep of glass walls revealing Manhattan, glittering below like a sea of stars. She drew a sharp breath, overwhelmed. "This place is incredible," she whispered. Adrian merely shrugged, as though it meant nothing, guiding her inside, with a hand that barely touched her back. The interior was spare but luxurious marble floors, steel accents shelves lined with art objects that looked more like museum pieces than decorations. Clara felt like an intruder. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and murmured, "I should not be here." Adrian poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "You can leave whenever you want," he said simply, "but you look like someone who does not want the night to end yet." His words disarmed her. She sipped the wine, trying to calm her racing nerves, but the warmth spread quickly through her chest. They moved to the window, the city sprawling endless beneath them. Clara felt the magnitude of it all press against her, the distance from the world. She knew the temptation to stay in this suspended moment. She glanced at Adrian, his profile stark against the glow, and for the first time, she saw not just the intimidating presence, but the shadow of loneliness in his eyes. Without thinking, she asked, "Do you ever feel alone up here?" His head turned slowly, gray eyes piercing hers. "More than you can imagine," he admitted. The honesty of it pierced her. They stood in silence until she realized she was shivering. Adrian set down his glass, stepped closer, and gently slipped her coat from her shoulders. The gesture was tender, almost reverent, not a move of conquest, but of care. Clara's breath caught. She felt the air charge between them, her skin tingling where his hand had grazed her arm. She should step back, she knew, but her body leaned forward instead, pulled by something she could not name. When he lowered his head slightly, she did not move away. Their lips met with the faintest pressure, a kiss tentative yet potent, and the world seemed to tilt. Clara clutched his shirt instinctively, her pulse wild. Adrian pulled back just enough to search her face. His voice hushed. "Clara, tell me to stop if this is not what you want." Her throat tightened. She whispered, "It is my first time." The words slipped free before she could cage them, hanging in the air, between them fragile and irrevocable. Adrian froze, eyes widening in shock. For a heartbeat, she feared he would laugh, dismiss her confession, or worse, retreat in disgust. But he did none of those things. Instead, his gaze softened, a quiet gravity overtaking him. "Then we will take it slow," he said. "No pressure, no expectations. Only what you choose." His words steadied her. Relief mingled with a nervous tremor. She nodded faintly, and he kissed her again, this time deeper, slower, careful in every motion. They moved together toward the bedroom, each step deliberate, as though they both knew this was a threshold neither could uncross. The room was bathed in muted light curtains, half-drawn sheets crisp and inviting. Adrian's hands traced her arms gently, his lips brushing her temple, her cheek, her mouth again, each gesture carrying respect rather than urgency. Clara trembled, her inexperience making her awkward, but he guided her with patience. When she hesitated, he stilled, waiting until she gave permission with a nod or a touch. Her heart ached with the strangeness of it. How something so terrifying could also feel so safe. She felt the reality of giving away the part of herself she had held guarded for so long. Yet instead of regret, she felt only an overwhelming tenderness. She clung to him, whispering his name, and he held her as though she was the most fragile and precious thing he had ever known. Hours blurred into one another until the city lights outside dimmed toward dawn. Clara lay against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, her body humming with exhaustion and wonder. She had thought the first time would be awkward, maybe disappointing, but instead it had been something she could never have predicted, an intimacy woven not only of touch but of trust. Adrian pressed a kiss to her hair, murmured nothing more, and drifted toward sleep. Clara stared into the darkness wide awake, her thoughts a storm. She had given her first night to a man she barely knew, a stranger. She had met by accident, yet part of her already felt the world had shifted. She did not yet understand who he truly was or what place he held in the world, but she sensed deep down that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Clara stirred to the sound of faint traffic murmuring from far below, the sunlight cutting sharp through the sheer curtains and laying gold across the bed. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways, every breath reminding her of what had happened hours earlier. For a fleeting moment, she let herself linger in the warmth of it, the memory of careful hands and steady eyes soothing her nerves. Then the realization crashed back, and her heart lurched. She sat up abruptly, clutching the sheet against her chest, her gaze sweeping the room. Adrian was no longer in bed. She caught the faint sound of water, running the low hum of a shower, and panic coursed through her veins. She had to leave before she lost all composure. She scrambled for her dress, still torn at the strap, slipped it over her head with trembling hands, and found her heels near the sofa. Her purse lay on a polished table beside a set of documents embossed with a name that froze her in place. Cole Dynamics. She blinked disbelief, rooting her to the floor. She had seen that logo countless times in the news attached to stories of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. Her pulse quickened as her mind pieced together fragments. Adrian Cole. It struck her like a thunderclap. The stranger she had trusted with her most guarded secret, the man she had given herself to without thought, was not just some anonymous dinner companion. He was the Adrian Cole, the billionaire CEO, known to every headline, the man journalists called a genius and a recluse. Clara's knees weakened as if the weight of his identity crushed her resolve. She felt like a fool, naive enough not to recognize him, blind enough to stumble into something that could never be undone. Shame clawed at her throat. Before she could gather her scattered courage, the sound of footsteps approached. Adrian emerged from the hallway, hair-damp shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his gaze steady. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, her panic stark against his unreadable calm. "Good morning," he said quietly, his tone as even as if nothing were out of place. Clara's mouth went dry. She fumbled for words, but none came. She grabbed her purse instead, clutching it like a shield, and muttered, "I have to go." He watched her without protest, his expression giving nothing away, and that indifference cut deeper than anger. She fled toward the door, her heels clattering against marble, and the instant she stepped into the hallway, the world exploded. Flashbulbs burst in her face, shouts echoing off the walls, cameras thrust forward as paparazzi swarmed. Clara froze blinded by the barrage. Questions collided in the air. Who is she, Adrian? Is she your new girlfriend? Did you spend the night together? The chaos pressed in, suffocating. She shielded her face with her hand, fighting for breath. But the photographers were relentless, their lenses devouring every inch of her panic. She pushed through them, heart hammering, stumbling, toward the stairwell, her mind screaming. This could not be real. Somehow she managed to slip out through a service exit, lungs burning as she gulped down the cold morning air. She hailed a cab with shaking hands, collapsed inside, and begged the driver to take her anywhere but here. Only when the door slammed shut did she allow herself to break tears, spilling silently as the city blurred past. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone was already vibrating uncontrollably, notifications flooding from every direction. She stared at the screen in horror. Headlines had erupted within minutes, gossip sites plastered with grainy photos of her leaving the penthouse. Unknown PR girl spends the night with tech billionaire Adrian Cole blared across the top of one article. Another declared mystery woman emerges from Cole's tower at dawn. Every image showed her face, half hidden, her dress torn, her eyes wide with fear, yet clear enough that anyone who knew her would recognize her instantly. Her chest tightened as she scrolled the comments filled with cruel speculation. Accusations of gold-digging, insinuations she had chased him for fame. She wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, she silenced it and curled into herself on the couch, trembling. Hours later, her boss called, voice taut with disapproval. "Clara, what have you done?" he demanded. "Do you realize what kind of attention you've brought to the firm? Clients are calling already." She stammered explanations, insisted it was a mistake, but his tone was cold. "We cannot afford scandal. Keep your head down and pray. This fades." He hung up before she could respond. The words left her hollow. Her father called next, his voice sharp with suspicion. "What is this nonsense I'm reading?" "Is it true?" Clara bit her lip, unable to defend herself. He sighed in disgust and told her to fix it, his disappointment louder than any shout. By evening, Clara sat in darkness, the blinds drawn tight, her body still aching, her spirit fractured. She had thought her mistake would remain private, something she could regret in silence, but now it was a spectacle broadcast to millions. And worst of all, she had no idea how Adrian would respond. He had been calm, detached, offering no hint of support, no denial or defense. Perhaps to him, she was nothing more than another nameless woman leaving his bed, a story to be forgotten by morning. The thought pierced her deeper than the headlines. In one reckless night, Clara had lost control of everything: her privacy, her dignity, her carefully guarded heart. And as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she realized with dread certainty that the world would not let her forget who Adrian Cole was, even if he already seemed to have forgotten her. Clara spent the next several days moving like a shadow through her own life, avoiding eye contact, on the subway, ducking into side streets to escape the whispers she imagined followed her everywhere. At work, the atmosphere was icy, her colleagues whispering behind screens, her supervisor assigning her the least visible tasks as if trying to erase her presence. She endured it with clenched teeth, telling herself the scandal would pass, that Adrian Cole lived in a world so far above hers that soon the attention would drift to some other distraction. Yet the humiliation festered, and each night she lay awake remembering the weight of his gaze and the quiet steadiness of his voice, wondering why, He had let her walk away so easily. One evening, desperate to breathe, she left her apartment and wandered aimlessly until she reached a small park where street lamps glowed against the early autumn dusk. She sat on a bench, her thoughts heavy, until movement caught her eye. Across the path, a man crouched near a worn blanket where a homeless woman huddled with a child. Clara watched as the man set down a bag of groceries, speaking softly. His large frame bent with gentleness. Recognition jolted her. It was Adrian. He wore no tailored suit tonight, only a simple sweater and dark jeans, but there was no mistaking him. She shrank back instinctively, afraid he might see her, but then curiosity pulled her gaze forward. He handed the child a sandwich, ruffled his hair with an almost brotherly affection, then pressed cash discreetly into the mother's hand. The woman's eyes shone with tears and gratitude, but Adrian only shook his head as if refusing thanks and walked away into the shadows. Clara's chest tightened. This was not the cold playboy the tabloids portrayed. This was a man who carried secrets in silence, who gave without expecting applause. She rose from the bench slowly, but by the time she thought to call his name, he was gone. The image of him lingered, unraveling something inside her. Days later at the office, Clara overheard coworkers gossiping about Coal Dynamics funding a scholarship program for underprivileged youth. A detail tucked into a press release almost no one had noticed. She dug deeper curiosity, overcoming shame, and discovered a string of anonymous donations linked to the same trust. Each initiative spoke of education, health shelter, never glamour, always necessity. The realization unsettled her. Adrian had been helping quietly all along, and she had misjudged him as indifferent. Her heart warred with her mind. She could not forget the sting of his silence when paparazzi devoured her, but she also could not deny what she had seen with her own eyes. The man she had thought a stranger was far more complicated. The next Saturday, Clara ventured into Central Park sketchbook in hand, seeking solace in drawing the trees and fountains. She perched on a stone bench pencil, scratching across the page, when a familiar shadow fell across her. She looked up and froze. Adrian stood there, a coffee cup in each hand, his expression unreadable. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the empty space beside her. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He sat handing her one of the cups. For a time they watched joggers and children, racing kites, the silence between them, strangely comfortable. Finally Clara spoke, her voice quiet. "Why do you do it?" "Do what?" he asked, turning his head slightly. "Help people without letting anyone know. Most men with your resources would want the world to see." Adrian's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Recognition is noise. If it is about me, it is not about them." Clara studied him, trying to read the layers in his face. "You're not who people think you are, and you are not who they think either," he said softly. She blinked, startled. "I never meant for that story to explode," she whispered. "I never wanted to be in the headlines." "I know," Adrian replied, his gaze fixed ahead. They sat in silence, the sound of wind rustling leaves around them. For the first time since the scandal, Clara felt her guard lower, the ache in her chest easing. She told him about her mother, about losing her too soon, about the way her father had grown distant. Adrian listened with quiet intensity, not interrupting, not offering platitudes. When she finished, he shared his own story, the brother he had lost, the guilt that never left. Their pain lay bare between them, fragile and real. It startled Clara. how much easier it was to speak to him than to anyone else, as though they recognized the same scars in one another. Evening fell, and lights flickered on across the park. Clara shivered, pulling her coat tighter, and Adrian stood without a word, shrugging out of his own jacket to drape over her shoulders. She looked up her breath, catching at the closeness, the rare softness in his eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. His hand brushed hers briefly, a touch that lingered longer than necessary, and the silence that followed was charged, filled with the possibility of something neither dared name yet. When they parted, Clara walked home with her steps lighter. Her heart conflicted, but undeniably stirred. She had thought their night together was a mistake that ruined her, yet now she wondered if it had instead revealed a path she had not known she was seeking. Adrian watched her go, from a distance, his own chest tightening with a feeling he had long sworn to avoid. She was dangerous not because she sought his wealth, but because she saw past it. And for the first time in years, he was not sure he wanted to look away. The weeks that followed carried a fragile balance. Clara had never expected to find a rhythm of quiet encounters and hesitant conversations, where laughter surfaced unexpectedly and long silences carried weight instead of discomfort. She told herself not to trust it, that Adrian belonged to a world too vast for her. But her heart betrayed her whenever his gaze lingered or when his voice softened around her name. Yet just as she began to believe the noise of the scandal might fade, another storm gathered on the horizon, this one more calculated and cruel. Vanessa Blake had once been Adrian's companion in both business and society columns, a glamorous investor with sharp intelligence and a sharper hunger for power. She had enjoyed the spotlight that came with his name, but when he ended things years earlier, citing irreconcilable values her pride had never recovered, now she returned with a vengeance sharpened by time. A glossy magazine broke the story first, an exclusive claiming Clara was an opportunist who had orchestrated the scandal to trap Adrian. Photos were splashed across the pages, Clara entering his penthouse, leaving with disheveled hair, paired with captions dripping with innuendo. Clara stared at the issue in disbelief, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. Megan tried to console her, insisting it was all lies, but the damage was immediate. At work, her manager called her into a sterile conference room and informed her that the firm could not sustain the distraction any longer. With icy sympathy, he suggested she resign quietly. The humiliation cut deep. Clara packed her desk that afternoon, ignoring the whispers that followed her down the hallway, her career reduced to ashes in the span of weeks. Meanwhile, Adrian fought fires of his own. Coal Dynamics was in the middle of negotiating a major contract with government agencies, and investors grew restless at any hint of instability. Adrian buried himself in meetings and reports, barely pausing to breathe. Clara tried to reach him once, sending a text that went unanswered. Days stretched into a blur of anxiety and silence. She told herself he was busy, that his empire required his focus, but each ignored call carved a deeper wound. Then came the gala, an opulent charity event at the Met, where the city's elite gathered under chandeliers and champagne towers. Clara did not intend to attend, but Megan persuaded her, insisting she could not hide forever. Clara arrived in a borrowed dress, nerves frayed, determined to hold her head high. The moment she stepped into the grand hall, whispers followed eyes darting toward her with open speculation. She forced a smile, moved among strangers, and tried to pretend she belonged. Then her gaze caught on the far side of the room and froze. Adrian stood tall in a black suit, his presence commanding, even amid the glittering crowd. But he was not alone. Vanessa Blake clung gracefully to his arm, her gown a cascade of silver, her smile sharp with victory. The sight struck Clara like a physical blow. Her breath faltered, her chest tightened, and the glass in her hand trembled dangerously. She wanted to believe it was an illusion, that Vanessa had cornered him for a photograph. But as she watched Adrian lean slightly to hear her words, the ache in Clara's heart became unbearable. The air seemed to suffocate her. She slipped away from the crowd, her heels echoing against marble floors as she fled toward the exit. Megan chased after her, calling her name, but Clara could not stop. She burst into the night, the city's chill slamming into her as tears blurred her vision. How could she have been so foolish to imagine she mattered to him, that she was more than a passing mistake? Behind her, cameras flashed again, capturing Adrian with Vanessa fueling headlines that would scream by morning. Inside the gala, Vanessa leaned close, her voice a purr dripping with poison. "See how easily she breaks," she whispered. Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the doors Clara had vanished through, but duty and pride chained him in place. Vanessa smirked, triumphant. By the time Clara reached home, her resolve had hardened. She packed a small bag, determined to leave Manhattan for a while, to reclaim some piece of herself beyond the humiliation and heartbreak. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. She whispered to the empty room, never again. Adrian did not belong to her, and she would not let him destroy what little was left of her pride. Across the city, Adrian sat in his study long after the gala. Vanessa's laughter still ringing in his ears, anger simmering beneath his calm mask. He knew she had engineered the stories, the whispers, the photographs, all calculated to wedge Clara away from him. Yet he also knew his own silence had made it worse. Clara had run from him, not only because of Vanessa's lies, but because he had failed to protect her when she needed it most. For the first time in years, Adrian felt powerless, watching something slip through his grasp that mattered more than any contract or fortune. Clara, alone in her apartment, told herself she would move on, but her heart refused to obey. Clara tried to piece together a new rhythm after the gala disaster, but every morning the tabloids screamed her name beside Adrian's and Vanessa's, as if her pain were entertainment. She deleted social media, avoided old colleagues, and walked quickly past newsstands. But she could not escape the whispers that trailed her even on subway platforms. Determined not to drown, she threw herself into freelance PR work, helping small local businesses polish their branding. But each project was modest, barely covering rent. Megan urged her to fight back to call Adrian, but Clara's pride locked her in silence. She told herself she had survived worse, that losing her mother had taught her resilience. Yet at night, loneliness pressed heavy. One evening, after meeting a client, she noticed a black sedan lingering near her block. She brushed it off as coincidence, but the following week, she spotted the same car again. Anxiety grew. Megan insisted she report it, but Clara feared looking paranoid. What she did not know was that Vanessa had hired investigators, not just to dig up dirt, but to intimidate her into disappearing. The pressure mounted until one rainy night, as Clara crossed an intersection, The headlights of a speeding car swerved unnaturally close. Tires screeched, horns blared, and in the chaos, Clara was struck and thrown against the pavement. Pain seared through her body before everything went black. News of the accident reached Adrian within the hour. He abandoned a board meeting, his face pale as he raced to the hospital. When he arrived, Clara lay unconscious, her arm-fractured ribs bruised, and a gash marking her temple. Machines beeped steadily, each sound a fragile lifeline. Adrian's chest tightened with guilt, rage, and a fear he had not felt since losing his brother. He sat beside her bed, gripping her cold hand, whispering apologies she could not hear. That night, he vowed silently to uncover the truth. His team of private investigators worked relentlessly, combing through street cameras near the crash. Within days, footage surfaced of the same black sedan tailing Clara in previous weeks. The rental records led directly back to a shell company connected to Vanessa Blake. Adrian's fury was icy precise. He had tolerated her manipulations before, but endangering Clara's life was beyond forgiveness. At the same time, another discovery shattered him in a different way. While reviewing donations through Coal Dynamics' philanthropic arm, he stumbled on repeated anonymous contributions under the alias C. Hayes. Further inquiry confirmed Clara had quietly funneled what little savings she had into scholarships and community centers supported by his foundation. Adrian stared at the records in disbelief. She had been giving all along, never seeking recognition, never even telling him. The woman the media branded a gold digger had been sacrificing for others with no audience. His throat tightened as he realized how profoundly he had misjudged her and how blind he had been to her true heart. Meanwhile, Clara drifted between pain and fragments of consciousness. In feverish moments, she remembered Adrian's touch, the way he had once shielded her from flashing cameras. But then Vanessa's image would invade, and the ache returned. She believed he had chosen Vanessa at the gala, and that made the betrayal cut deeper. Yet even in her confusion, she whispered his name in the dark, unaware that Adrian remained by her side night after night, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair, refusing to leave until she opened her eyes. Reporters swarmed outside, speculating wildly about the accident, some even suggesting Clara had staged it for sympathy. Adrian held a press conference, not to clarify business, but to defend her dignity. His voice was sharp as steel as he condemned the harassment she had endured and vowed to hold those responsible accountable. The media frenzy intensified, but for the first time, Adrian showed the world a glimpse of his personal heart. Investors worried, rivals smirked, but he no longer cared. His focus was singular: protect Clara and restore her faith in him. The investigation gathered more evidence. A witness, a street vendor, testified that he had seen the suspicious car accelerate deliberately before the collision. Another identified the driver as someone on Vanessa's payroll. Piece by piece, the case built until Adrian knew he had enough to confront her. But his mind was divided between vengeance and the fragile figure in the hospital bed. Each time Clara stirred or murmured in her sleep, he leaned closer, whispering promises that she would never be alone again. Clara's recovery was slow and painful. She awoke briefly to see Adrian slumped beside her. Exhaustion etched across his features, but she assumed it was guilt driving him, not love. She turned away, tears pricking her eyes, unwilling to let herself hope again. Yet beneath her hurt, she remembered his quiet strength. the softness in his voice when he spoke of his brother, and doubt gnawed at her anger. Perhaps she had judged too quickly. Still, the memory of Vanessa clinging to him at the gala burned too vividly. Days bled into weeks until the hospital discharge approached. Adrian arranged for private care at his penthouse, but Clara resisted, fiercely insisting she would not be his responsibility. They argued softly but intensely, her pride colliding with his determination. In the end, Megan persuaded her to accept at least temporary care, reminding her that healing alone in a small apartment would be reckless. Reluctantly, Clara agreed, though she resolved not to let comfort cloud her judgment. Within Adrian's walls, she experienced again the quiet luxury that once terrified her, but this time she noticed details she had missed before: shelves lined with medical journals, belonging to his late brother's sketches of software concepts scattered on his desk, a piano in the corner with sheet music marked by wear. The fortress of steel and glass concealed a human heart, bruised but still beating. Adrian watched her discover these pieces, hoping silently that she might see him as more than the billionaire the world painted. Meanwhile, his legal team prepared charges against Vanessa. The stage was set for confrontation, but the deeper battle raged within Adrian as he wondered whether Clara could ever forgive him for his silence, for the misunderstandings, and for failing to shield her from the storm that nearly destroyed her. Adrian moved with deliberate calm, though inside his veins burned with fury, when he finally confronted Vanessa in a glass-walled conference room, where lawyers and investigators sat waiting. She arrived draped in confidence, her silver heels clicking like a metronome of arrogance, but the folder of evidence on the table silenced even her smirk. Adrian spoke with quiet authority, presenting security footage, witness statements, and rental agreements, all linking her to the black sedan that had nearly ended Clara's life. Vanessa's mask cracked as the lawyers detailed the charges of conspiracy and attempted harm, but she tried to laugh it off, accusing Adrian of fabricating evidence to protect his latest fling. His eyes were cold as he told her that power without integrity was nothing and that she would answer to the law. Police officers stepped forward, reading her rights as cameras outside the building captured her being led away, the once untouchable socialite now a disgraced figure. Yet even as justice was served, Adrian's mind remained fixed on the hospital where Clara still struggled to heal. That evening he returned to her bedside, exhaustion weighing on him, yet determination stronger than ever. Clara lay pale against the sheets, her eyes fluttering open as he entered. For a moment, silence hung heavy until she whispered hoarsely, asking why he was there. Adrian took her hand, voice thick with emotion, and confessed that he had been blind, believing he needed no one, but realizing now he needed her more than air. He admitted his silence had hurt her. His pride had created distance, but he could no longer hide behind walls of control. Clara turned her face away, tears welling, and told him she was never after his fortune, never after his empire, only after the man she glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. Her voice trembled as she said she had loved him, even when it made no sense, even when the world called her a fool. Adrian's composure broke as he pressed her hand to his lips, promising to cherish her not as a trophy, nor a distraction, but as the woman who had taught him that vulnerability could be strength. For a long moment, neither spoke, their eyes carrying the weight of every misunderstanding, every wound, every unspoken yearning. Then, slowly, Clara reached for him, her fingers brushing his cheek, as she whispered that she was willing to forgive, but not if he ever hid himself from her again. The dam of restraint shattered. Adrian leaned down their foreheads, touching both, trembling under the enormity of emotions long suppressed. The steady beeping of hospital machines seemed to fade as he kissed her gently, reverently, as if sealing a vow. Tears mingled with smiles as Clara let herself believe that perhaps this love was real, born not from scandal, but from survival, from shared loneliness, now transformed into connection. Outside, the press speculated wildly about Vanessa's arrest and the future of coal dynamics. But within that quiet room, only two souls existed. The billionaire once defined by isolation and the young woman once branded reckless held onto each other as though the rest of the world could wait. Clara's recovery marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for Adrian, as well as he chose to no longer hide their connection behind closed doors. The day she was discharged, he walked with her past the cluster of reporters gathered outside the hospital, his hand firmly clasping hers as flashes erupted around them. For the first time, he addressed the public, not with corporate statements, but with honesty, declaring Clara as the woman who had stood by him when no one else dared, and the one who mattered beyond the empire he had built. Headlines shifted from scandal to admiration, the narrative reframing from opportunist to survivor of betrayal, turned into partner in resilience. Clara braced for judgment, yet found surprising support, as women praised her strength and authenticity. Weeks later, she took on a leadership role in a community project sponsored by Coal Dynamics, spearheading initiatives for education and digital access in underserved neighborhoods. Standing before crowds not as a shadow of Adrian, but as her own voice, Clara proved that she was more than the rumors that had haunted her. Adrian attended quietly at the back of these events, his gaze filled with pride as he watched her command the room with warmth and conviction. Their private life blossomed in tandem with their public responsibilities. Dinners once marked by silence now echoed with laughter, arguments softened into conversations that deepened understanding, and evenings often ended with shared dreams about the future rather than fears of exposure. Clara's confidence grew as she saw that her worth did not depend on tabloids or corporate elites, but on the lives she touched through genuine work. Adrian, too, began to shed the armor of detachment opening about his grief, for his brother allowing Clara to comfort him in ways he had long resisted. In boardrooms, he was still the formidable CEO, but with her, he allowed vulnerability, and that made him stronger rather than weaker. Their love became a quiet rebellion against the cynicism of their world, a testament that truth and compassion could prevail even amid power and wealth. By the time spring warmed the city, the once sensational scandal had transformed into a story of redemption of two broken souls, choosing each other and building something lasting. Clara no longer flinched at paparazzi lenses because she knew the woman they captured was no longer running or hiding, but standing tall beside the man who had finally learned to love without conditions. On a gentle spring evening, the rooftop of Adrian's penthouse had been transformed into a haven of light and blossoms, with strings of lanterns swaying in the breeze and roses lining the terrace that overlooked the glittering skyline of New York. Clara stood by the edge of the balcony, her hair catching the soft wind, her eyes reflecting the city she once thought too vast to ever hold a place for her. Adrian approached quietly, carrying none of the guarded aura that had once defined him, only a simple velvet box in his hand and a tremor of anticipation in his chest. He called her name, and when she turned, he spoke not as the billionaire the world knew, but as the man who had been remade by love, confessing that he had once proposed for all the wrong reasons. And tonight he wanted to do it again for the only reason that mattered. Dropping to one knee, he opened the box, revealing a diamond that sparkled like captured starlight, and asked with a voice steady yet tender if she would give them another chance to begin anew. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not of sorrow but of joy, as she whispered her acceptance, knowing that every wound and every trial had led to this moment. Adrian slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, then rose to pull her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let her go again. Their kiss beneath the canopy of stars was both a promise and a release, washing away doubts and sealing the truth that they belonged together. Months later, Clara walked into a community center, opening ceremony, her gown simple, her smile radiant with Adrian at her side, applauding not just as her partner, but as her greatest supporter. Reporters asked about their journey, and she answered that love was not a game or a possession, but a choice made daily to trust, to fight, and to cherish. Adrian echoed her words, declaring that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with. The crowd erupted in applause, but for the two of them, the world had shrunk to the warmth of joined hands. From a wrong date with a stranger, to a night that changed everything, to scandal, pain, and redemption. Their story had traveled a path no one could have scripted, yet it was theirs and it was real. As the evening closed and the city lights shimmered around them, Clara rested her head against Adrian's chest, listening to the heartbeat that had once been locked away, but now beat only for her, and she whispered softly that she had finally found home. Thank you, dear listeners, for staying with Clara and Adrian through every twist, every heartbreak, and every tender moment that shaped their journey from a wrong date to a love that defied all odds. Their story reminds us that sometimes mistakes are not accidents at all, but hidden doors to the life we are meant to live. If you felt your heart race, if you wiped away a tear or smiled at their happiness, then I ask you to keep this story alive by joining our family here on this channel. Your support is what makes it possible for me to bring you tales that touch the soul week after week. So please, if you have not already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter of love, redemption, and hope. And if this story stirred something inside you, let me know in the comments. I truly want to hear. What part resonated with you most? Was it Clara's courage to stand tall against the world, or Adrian's moment of breaking his walls to admit he could not live without love? Share your thoughts, because your voice helps shape the stories we create together. And if you enjoyed the emotional roller coaster, please give this video a like. It is a small gesture, but it tells YouTube to share our stories with more hearts who might need them. I also invite you to share this video with a friend or loved one, because you never know whose heart might need the reminder that true love exists even when it comes from the most unexpected places. For those who feel deeply connected to our storytelling journey, consider supporting us through the donation link in the description. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps me keep creating stories filled with passion, detail, and heart, so that we can continue building this global community of dreamers and believers. I want you to know that you are more than just viewers to me. You are family spread across the world, each of you bringing your own experiences and emotions to these narratives. Together, we prove that storytelling still has the power to unite, inspire, and heal. So as we close tonight's chapter, I leave you with this promise. The next story will take you on another unforgettable journey, one that will stir your imagination, challenge your heart, and leave you craving the next episode. Until then, may love surround you, may peace follow you, and may your own story be filled with unexpected miracles. Remember to subscribe, comment, like, and share, because with your presence, we can keep this circle of love and storytelling alive. Thank you for being here, and I cannot wait to see you in the next story.